The wind over Argentia carried the salt of the North Atlantic, and the metallic tang of machinery. The fog hung low, veiling the base in a ghostly pallor that blurred the outlines of men, aircraft, and the restless sea beyond the runway. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Hart stood at the edge of the tarmac, her gloved hand resting on the cold aluminum fuselage of the B-24 Vigilant Star. She was 32, tall and slender, with dark chestnut hair cut to regulation length beneath her flight cap. Her face, angular yet composed, carried the kind of stillness that came only from years of learning how not to flinch. Not from wind, not from doubt, not from men who questioned why she was there. Her blue-gray eyes were steady as she watched mechanics scurry like ants around the bomber, checking the new ASV-MTC-3 radar unit that glowed faintly beneath the nose glass. Behind her, Chief Mechanic Robert Bob Halpern, a square-shouldered man in his 40s with oil-streaked hands and the weary eyes of someone who'd worked since dawn, called out, "Radar's humming, Commander. She's yours whenever you're ready to scare the sky." His grin was lopsided, the mark of a man who'd learned humor as armor. Evelyn nodded but didn't return the smile. Bob had lost his younger brother aboard a merchant ship, sunk by a U-boat last winter. His easy words couldn't hide the flicker of grief that surfaced whenever submarines were mentioned. Inside the operations room, the atmosphere smelled of coffee and tension. Maps stretched across the table like wounded skins, dotted with red pins marking U-boat sightings. The hum of typewriters mixed with the clatter of teletypes bringing encrypted messages from London. Evelyn entered, her flight jacket still damp with fog. Heads turned. Some looked with curiosity, others with skepticism. She had long grown used to that, the unspoken disbelief that a woman could carry the burden of command. At the center of the room stood Commander James Holloway, her superior, a tall, hawk-faced officer in his early 40s, with a voice like gravel and eyes that never softened. A veteran of the Atlantic convoys, Holloway bore a thin scar across his jawline from a shrapnel wound sustained aboard a destroyer in 1941. It had made him colder, more precise. He pointed at the map without preamble. "Bletchley's picked up a new transmission pattern from the Kriegsmarine. 8 boats, Type 9, moving west, too organized for coincidence." Evelyn stepped closer, her gaze following the inked lines across the ocean. "Formation sailing? In daylight?" she asked. Holloway's brow furrowed. "That's the theory. They're calling it Operation Ghost Tide. The bastards think the mid-Atlantic is still beyond our reach." A murmur went around the room. Evelyn's heart quickened, not from fear but from something sharper, an electric sense of purpose. "Sir, the Vigilant Star's radar can pick them up even. In this fog, let us fly the gap," she said. Holloway studied her, the silence long enough to stretch into challenge. "You realize what you're asking. No escort, no backup. You'd be alone out there." Evelyn met his gaze. "If they're crossing the gap, we'll be the first to know, or the last to fly." The corner of Holloway's mouth twitched, not quite approval, not quite doubt. "Brief your crew. You leave at ZOA 600. As she turned to leave, she caught the look of Lieutenant Sarah O'Neill, the unit's communications officer. A petite woman with curly auburn hair and a soft Irish accent that hardened only when she was on the radio. Sarah was one of the few who treated Evelyn as an equal. "You sure about this, Evie?" she murmured as she passed. Evelyn paused by the doorway. "I'd rather die chasing ghosts than sit waiting for them to find us." Outside, night had fallen over Argentia. The runway lights glowed dim through the mist. Evelyn walked back toward the hangar, the rhythmic sound of her boots on wet concrete echoing in the emptiness. She ran a hand over the smooth curve of the bomber's nose, feeling the vibration of its idle engines like a heartbeat beneath metal skin. For a moment, she imagined the ocean beyond, cold, endless, full of unseen shapes rising and falling beneath the waves. In her quarters, she sat at a small desk under a flickering bulb and opened the worn leather journal she carried since flight school. Inside were names, not of victories, but of those who hadn't come back. She added another blank line beneath them. "For tomorrow," she whispered. Her crew for the mission gathered before dawn. Sergeant Nora Mitchell, the flight engineer and gunner, stood by the plane's belly hatch, sipping black coffee. Nora was 27, tall, with sandy blonde hair tied back and grease on her fingertips. She had the dry humor of someone who could rebuild an engine faster than most men could curse at it. "Morning, Commander," she greeted. "Sky's moody today, perfect for trouble." "Then let's not keep it waiting," Evelyn replied, pulling on her gloves. Also aboard were Ensign David Cooper, the bombardier, a wiry man with boyish freckles and a constant air of nervous curiosity, and Radio Officer Tom Avery, quiet and methodical, his spectacles always slightly fogged. Each had their fears buried under routine, each pretending not to notice the trembling hands as they checked equipment. The engines roared to life, slicing through the dawn mist. The ground crew stepped back, their faces glowing orange from the flare of exhaust. Evelyn felt the vibration through her bones as she eased the throttle forward. The bomber rolled down the slick runway and lifted, heavy and deliberate, into the pale light. At 3,000 feet, Argentia became a gray smudge beneath them. The clouds swallowed the world. Evelyn's hand stayed steady on the controls, but her thoughts drifted to the letter from her mother she hadn't opened, to the faces of the men she'd trained with who never made it past their first mission. She'd joined to prove something, but she no longer remembered to whom. The sea below was invisible, only sensed, a dark mass pressing up from the mist. Tom's voice crackled through the intercom. "Radar's live, ma'am. We're painting shadows." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Then, let's see which ones are real." The crew fell silent, each wrapped in their own thoughts. Nora hummed softly, a tune Evelyn recognized from church hymns long ago. The steady drone of the engines filled the space between fear and courage. Hours passed. The monotony of open sky gave way to a thin horizon where storm clouds gathered. Evelyn watched them form like bruises across the heavens. Somewhere beneath that rolling gray, unseen shapes were moving west. Men who believed themselves invincible. Evelyn adjusted her flight goggles and looked ahead. She didn't believe in fate, only in preparation and persistence. But a voice in the back of her mind whispered something she couldn't shake. That history didn't just happen. It waited for someone brave or foolish enough to meet it halfway. And as Vigilant Star cut through the first edge of the storm, Evelyn Hart realized she was flying straight into history's waiting hands. The Baltic Sea shimmered under a bleak morning light, the surface flat as glass, only disturbed by the rising mist that curled like smoke over the docks of Kiel. The air carried the smell of salt, diesel, and steel, the breath of a navy that had learned to live beneath the waves. Standing at the edge of the pier, Kapitänleutnant Ingrid Weiss adjusted her gray officer's cap, her sharp gaze fixed on the long, dark hull of U-913 resting in its berth. She was 31, tall and poised, her posture as straight as the periscope mast that rose behind her. Her blonde hair was cut short and tucked neatly beneath her cap, and her pale blue eyes held the kind of distance found in people who had lost too much to show anything but control. Her uniform, pressed to perfection, did little to soften the lines of her face. It was a face that carried quiet authority, carved from discipline and grief. Behind her, boots clattered on wet metal as the crew prepared for departure. Voices barked in clipped German, ropes tightened, valves hissed. U-913 was new, its paint still glossy, the swastika flag at its stern snapping sharply in the cold wind. Ingrid turned as an aide approached. Oberleutnant Karl Brenner, her executive officer, a tall man with dark stubble and a streak of silver at his temple. He was 40, a career sailor hardened by the Atlantic campaign, known for his calm precision and his superstition. Brenner had survived 3 sinkings, and since the last one, he carried a small St. Christopher medallion on his neck, rubbing it when storms rolled in. "All systems ready, Kapitänleutnant," he reported. "Torpedoes loaded, fuel tanks topped. The men are uneasy, but eager." "Uneasy keeps them alive," Ingrid replied in a low voice. She looked out over the water again. "Eager gets them killed." Ingrid's command had been an experiment. A woman leading a U-boat crew, something unthinkable for most officers of the Kriegsmarine. But Grand Admiral Donitz himself had approved it after witnessing her extraordinary aptitude in navigation and tactical analysis at the Naval Academy. She had lost her husband, Friedrich, an army officer, during the hellish siege of Stalingrad. His final letter, half burned, stained with ash, had been found among the ruins by a comrade. Since then, Ingrid had stripped herself of anything resembling warmth. She believed in precision, not pity, in orders, not emotions. The harbor loudspeakers crackled to life, summoning her to headquarters. She strode across the dock, her boots striking the planks with rhythmic certainty. Inside the command building, the air was thick with tobacco and the hum of tension. On the wall hung maps of the North Atlantic, a constellation of red and blue marks spreading across the ocean like blood drops on parchment. At the center of the room stood Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz, short but broad-shouldered, with piercing gray eyes and a voice that carried the conviction of a zealot. His uniform was immaculate, metals shining beneath the dim light. "Kapitänleutnant Weiss," he said without turning from the map, "you understand the significance of what we're attempting." "Yes, Herr Gross Admiral," she replied crisply, standing at attention. He faced her, studying her expression for weakness and finding none. "Operation Ghost Tide," he said. "A daytime formation transit across the Atlantic. 7 boats, including yours, will move together, openly. We will challenge Allied air superiority and reclaim the element of surprise. You will lead the northern flank." Ingrid's brows furrowed slightly. "A daylight crossing, sir? That exposes us to aircraft patrols." Dönitz nodded. "It's a risk, yes, but the Allies have grown predictable. They think we hide beneath the waves. Let them think so. You will strike where they believe us weakest." He paused. "If this works, it will change the course of the Atlantic War." Ingrid saluted. "It will work." As she left the office, Brenner was waiting at the steps, lighting a cigarette despite the icy drizzle. He glanced at her. "So it's true, then? Daylight." "Yes." He exhaled smoke and smiled without humor. "The sea's going to love that." By midday, U-913 slipped silently from the harbor, joining 6 other Type 9 submarines, already assembling beyond the fjord. The water gleamed like a sheet of polished iron, the sky low and sullen. From the conning tower, Ingrid watched the line of gray silhouettes ahead. U-532, U-559, U-585, U-604, U-651, and U-704. Each commanded by men she knew by reputation, each carrying 50 souls into a wager with the ocean. Her helmsman, Matthias Kruger, a broad-shouldered young man of 23 with sandy hair and the naive confidence of someone who'd never seen a convoy up close, called out, "Depth set for periscope level, Kapitänleutnant. All engines steady." His hands gripped the controls tightly, knuckles pale. Ingrid nodded. "Hold course at 090. We'll rise to surface once we clear the fjord." In the cramped control room, the red lights flickered over the crew's tense faces. The air smelled of oil and sweat, the rhythmic hum of the engines like a heartbeat pulsing through steel. Ingrid stood near the periscope well, her mind already moving 3 steps ahead. She thought of Dönitz's words, of risk, of pride, of victory, and of how little those words meant to the men who would drown for them. When they surfaced, the sunlight hit the deck like cold fire. Spray whipped across her face as she climbed to the conning tower, scanning the horizon through binoculars. The other submarines formed a rough spearhead, their wakes cutting pale scars through the gray sea. It was a sight both beautiful and absurd, hunters moving boldly through enemy skies. Brenner joined her, his face half hidden beneath his cap. "First daylight formation in the history of the Kriegsmarine," he murmured. "History may remember this as courage or madness." "Both often look the same," Ingrid replied. They sailed northward, engines pounding beneath their feet, gulls wheeling overhead like restless spirits. Inside, the crew settled into routine, plotting bearings, monitoring depth, checking torpedo tubes. Yet beneath the mechanical rhythm lay the unspoken fear, the sky. They all knew Allied aircraft hunted there, unseen until too late. Hours passed. The sun began to sink, the sea turning from gray to steel blue. Ingrid stood alone on the bridge, her gloved hands resting on the railing. The wind bit at her cheeks. She felt the weight of command pressing on her chest, not fear, but an almost physical ache of responsibility. Below her, 50 men trusted her to navigate both sea and fate. She thought briefly of Friedrich again, his last letter, his promise that the war would end soon. She wondered if he had believed it, or if he'd simply wanted her to. The memory stung like salt in a wound she refused to close. Brenner's voice broke the silence. "Message from U-585, ma'am. They've spotted aircraft contrails to the west, high altitude." Ingrid narrowed her eyes, lifting her binoculars. Against the glare, faint white lines streaked across the horizon. Distant, deliberate. All boats dive to 20 meters, she ordered, silent running. The klaxon blared briefly, then cut off. The U-boat slid beneath the waves, the ocean swallowing its sound. The sudden quiet inside was almost suffocating. Ingrid moved through the control room, checking gauges, listening to the creak of pressure tightening around the hull. Her crew's faces were pale but disciplined. She placed a steady hand on the chart table, tracing their position. Brenner leaned close, whispering, "If the planes spot one of us, the whole formation's finished." "They won't," she said. "The sea hides its loyal servants." But even as she spoke, she knew the truth. The Atlantic was loyal to no one. It devoured friend and foe alike. Hours later, as darkness reclaimed the surface, Ingrid surfaced again. The moonlight glimmered faintly off the waves, silver and cold. The radio crackled with Morse chatter from the other boats, confirming positions. For now, they were safe. But deep inside, Ingrid felt an unease she couldn't name, a sense that something unseen was watching from above. She looked up at the endless sky, at the quiet stars shimmering beyond the clouds. Somewhere out there, she thought, another woman might be looking down, searching these same waters for ghosts. And though she couldn't know her name, the current of fate had already begun to pull them toward each other. One from the sky, one from the depths, bound by the war that had turned oceans into graves and the heavens into hunting grounds. The sky hung low and swollen with rain, the Atlantic below it a restless sheet of steel-blue waves bruised by wind. At 13:42 GMT, Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Hart sat in the pilot's seat of the B-24 Liberator Vigilant Star, her gloved hand steady on the controls, despite the turbulence that rattled the heavy bomber. Drops of condensation slid down the canopy, catching flashes of silver light from the clouded sun. The aircraft trembled slightly. The sky itself seemed alive, tense, waiting. Evelyn's sharp hazel eyes, framed by the dark curls that escaped her flight cap, scanned the radar scope mounted beside her. On its flickering green surface, faint shapes began to coalesce into 7 distinct echoes. Her pulse quickened. 7 vessels moving together. Submarines surfaced. Exactly where there shouldn't have been any. "Contact!" called out Sergeant Nora Mitchell, her voice cutting through the static and engine roar. Nora was a woman in her late 20s, shorter than Evelyn, with strong shoulders and hair the color of copper that she kept tucked beneath a grease-stained flight bandana. Freckles dusted her nose, and a streak of gunpowder smudge marked her cheek. She never bothered wiping it off during missions. Nora had a warmth about her, but now her face was all steel and focus. She leaned over the radar screen, tapping it with one gloved finger. 7 signatures, Skipper. Same bearing, same speed. I'm getting echoes from the surface. That's no convoy. Those are U-boats. Evelyn's jaw tightened. Transmit coordinates to Argentia. Already trying, but Nora frowned, twisting the dials on the radio set. The equipment hissed and crackled like an angry storm. Heavy interference, signals cutting out. We might get half the message through, if we're lucky. Evelyn's eyes flicked to the fuel gauge, then back to the sea below. Her mind ran through every rule, every protocol drilled into her since flight school. But all of them came down to one simple truth. If those U-boats vanish beneath the surface, they're ghosts again. "Keep trying, Sergeant. I'll bring us lower." She pushed the yoke forward. The Vigilant Star descended into the rain, the engines howling against the wind. Spray burst against the nose as they broke below the cloud ceiling, and suddenly the Atlantic stretched wide beneath them, empty, vast, and alive with danger. Evelyn squinted through the rain streaking the windshield. Then, like a mirage made real, she saw them, 7 gray shapes, long and sleek, slicing the water in the tight formation. Their wakes fanned out in perfect symmetry. The sight sent a chill down her spine. It was both beautiful and horrifying. The mechanical precision of death on parade. Ingrid Weiss stood on the conning tower of U-913, the wind tearing at her coat when she heard it, a deep, thrumming growl that did not belong to the sea. It was distant at first, a vibration in the steel beneath her boots, but it grew quickly, rolling like thunder from the clouds above. She lifted her binoculars, scanning the horizon. The waves glittered under the light rain, and then, through a gap in the mist, she saw it, a silver silhouette cutting low and fast across the sky, a B-24 Liberator, the blood drained from her face. "Alarm! Dive! "Dive! Dive!" she shouted down the hatch, her voice carrying the cold edge of command. Klaxons blared. Men scrambled below deck, their boots hammering against the metal grating. Ingrid slid down the ladder, landing in the control room where Carl Brenner already barked orders. "Flood forward tanks. Crash dive to 60 meters." The lights flickered red as valves opened and ballast flooded. The sub began to tilt, nose down, plunging beneath the waves, but Evelyn had already committed. The rain lashed her windshield as she leveled out at attack height. "Target locked. 7 boats, tight pattern," she called through the intercom. Her voice was steady, calm, but her heart hammered so loud she could hear it over the engines. "Nora, open bomb bay. Let's make this count." Nora's fingers danced across the switches. The bomb bay doors groaned open beneath them, the sound a deep metallic yaw. "Doors open. Depth charges primed." She looked up toward Evelyn, eyes wide but fierce. "You sure you want to do this alone?" "If we wait for orders, they're gone," Evelyn said quietly. "We won't get another chance." She banked the plane hard to the left, circling back toward the formation. Below, one of the submarines was already slipping beneath the water, foam trailing from its deck. The others began to follow, too slow. Evelyn pressed her thumb to the release switch. The Vigilant Star roared overhead, and 4 depth charges dropped from its belly like steel rain. They tumbled through the air, trailing faint white smoke before striking the sea with deep, resounding thuds. Seconds later, the ocean erupted, geysers of gray water rising hundreds of feet, shockwaves rippling outward. Evelyn caught a glimpse of one submarine's stern lifting out of the water before it broke apart and vanished beneath the spray. On board U-913, the world turned into chaos. The explosion hit like a hammer, slamming Ingrid against the chart table. Lights burst and went dark. Pipes screamed under pressure. "Depth! 70 meters!" Brenner shouted. "Forward tanks flooding fast." Ingrid steadied herself, wiping blood from her brow. "Level the dive! Blow aft ballast!" The sub groaned like a living thing, the hull creaking as it fought against the sudden shift in weight. She could feel the men's panic rising like the pressure outside. She forced her voice to stay calm. "This is what we trained for. Keep your heads, all of you." In the Vigilant Star, Evelyn swung back around, eyes scanning the chaos below. 2 submarines were gone. Another listed "Seals" badly, black smoke curling from its aft deck. The others had vanished beneath the surface, leaving only oil and wreckage. Her breath caught in her throat, part triumph, part horror. Each explosion meant lives snuffed out, but each life meant fewer convoys attacked, fewer ships sunk. War had no victories, only survivals. Then, the anti-aircraft fire began. From the last surfaced U-boat, bright orange tracers ripped through the sky, climbing toward them like angry fireflies. "They're shooting back!" Nora yelled, ducking instinctively. Bullets rattled against the fuselage, tearing holes through the starboard wing. Warning lights blinked red across Evelyn's console. "Hold on!" Evelyn pulled the yoke hard, the bomber climbing sharply. The engine screamed in protest. She could feel the vibration through the frame, the desperate strain of metal and muscle. A round shattered the starboard window, spraying glass across the cockpit. She felt the sting on her cheek, but ignored it. Inside U-913, the sound of propellers faded as they descended deeper into the dark. The men moved with mechanical discipline, sealing hatches, checking gauges. Brenner's hands shook slightly as he monitored the depth meter. 80 meters! Hull integrity stable." Ingrid stood beside him, silent, her face pale but unreadable. She thought of the sound from above, the angry hum of engines, the distant thunder of bombs, and realized that their safe gap, the legendary mid-Atlantic void beyond Allied reach, had been shattered. "They've found us," she murmured. "The sky belongs to them now." The Vigilant Star leveled out again, smoke trailing from its wing. Evelyn exhaled slowly, trying to steady her shaking hands. Nora turned to her, eyes wide. "We need to report this, Ev. All of it." Evelyn nodded. "We will, but first..." She looked back at the sea, now calm again, indifferent to the carnage it had swallowed. "Let's make sure they don't come back up." She turned the bomber east, setting course for a second run. Her fuel gauge dipped dangerously low, but she ignored it. The Atlantic stretched endlessly ahead, gray and cruel, and somewhere beneath it, the enemy still moved. Ingrid sat in the dim red light of the control room, listening to the creak of the hull and the slow rhythm of her men's breathing. She closed her eyes for a moment, just long enough to let the reality sink in. The ocean was no longer a shield. It was a grave waiting to claim them. And far above, Evelyn Hart, the woman she had never met, drew her bomber through the storm, determined to finish what she had begun. The sky over the North Atlantic burned a cold silver, sun barely cutting through the rolling fog. The sea below was restless, dark as oil, mirroring the smoke that began to rise from the chaos beneath. Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Hart gripped the yoke of the Vigilant Star tightly, her knuckles white under her gloves. Sweat mixed with the salt of the air, her heartbeat sinking with the roar of the 4 engines. "Steady, steady," she whispered, eyes fixed on the radar blip now translating into the reality below. A line of black shapes slicing through the gray water. 7 of them. She counted. 7 U-boats, surfaced and vulnerable. Her co-pilot, Sergeant Nora Mitchell, was pale, a streak of blood on her temple from earlier turbulence. Nora, a woman in her early 30s with freckles across her sharp cheeks and auburn hair pinned under her headset, had always been the calmest under pressure. But not today. Her breathing was shallow, her left hand clutching her side where shrapnel had grazed her. "They're forming up! Jesus, Ev, they're not even diving yet!" Evelyn's voice was firm, though her chest felt tight. "Then, we don't give them the chance." She flicked the intercom, voice echoing through the fuselage. "Bombardier, ready the depth charges. We go in fast, from the sun." Her words were met with a curt acknowledgement from Corporal Dennis Price, a young bombardier from Boston, barely 22, his face still holding the softness of youth. But his eyes, hollow, distant, told of too many nights over the ocean, watching men vanish into smoke. Evelyn's decision to attack without clearance haunted the edge of her mind, but she forced the doubt away. Orders couldn't travel faster than death. She'd learned that much. The Vigilant Star dove into the glare of the mid-afternoon sun, her silver hull glinting like a falling blade. Evelyn's stomach dropped as the altimeter spun down. Wind howled against the fuselage. The U-boats below scattered in confusion, anti-aircraft gunners scrambling to their mounts. The first explosions came seconds later. Price's voice cracked over the comm. "Depth charges away!" 4 metal drums tumbled into the sea, slicing the waves before vanishing. Then came the roar, deep, gut-wrenching, primal. Water erupted into towering plumes of white and black. Fragments of steel launched skyward. Evelyn's vision blurred as shockwaves slammed into the Liberator. "Hits! Multiple hits!" Nora shouted, trying to focus through the pain. Evelyn caught glimpses below. 1 U-boat, marked U-903, split clean in half. Another, U-911, rolling onto its side as the ocean swallowed it whole. Then tracer fire shot upward, red streaks of defiance. Evelyn jerked the controls left, but a sudden burst tore through the right wing. The plane shuddered violently. "Right engine's hit!" Nora screamed. Evelyn felt the plane's pull, sluggish and uneven. Instruments blinked red. The smell of smoke filled the cabin. Below, in the depths of the storm, Kapitänleutnant Ingrid Weiss was fighting a different war. Water poured through a fracture in U-913's stern, alarms blaring like mechanical screams. Ingrid, tall and angular with platinum hair matted to her forehead, barked orders in a voice that cut through the chaos. "Seal compartment 6, blow ballast 2 and 3, dive, damn you, dive." Her first officer, Eric Muller, a lean man in his late 20s with a jagged scar across his jaw from a shell fragment at Narvik, was struggling to steady the dive planes. "We've lost trim control, Captain." Ingrid's pale blue eyes flicked to the flooding gauges. "Then we drown together," she said quietly, before gripping the periscope handles. The image above flickered, a plane, engulfed in sunlight, descending like vengeance. She'd heard of women flying for the Allies, but seeing one here, in this expanse of death, felt like a cruel twist of fate. "A woman's hand," she muttered. "So this is how the sea decides." A violent tremor shook the hull. Metal screamed. U-913 lurched downward, the bow angling steeply. Ingrid's shoulders slammed into the steel wall, pain blossoming like fire. She tasted blood. The sound of rushing water was deafening now. "Flooding contained," Mueller shouted, his voice cracking. "Depth 40 meters." Ingrid forced herself upright, her soaked uniform clinging to her like a shroud. "Silent running. If we surface, we die." Above them, Evelyn's aircraft was fighting to stay alive. "We've lost hydraulic pressure," Nora groaned. Evelyn's hands trembled on the controls. "We can still climb," she whispered, half to herself, half to the dying machine. Through the smoke, she saw the ocean speckled with wreckage, oil fires blooming like dark roses. She could almost hear the screams, muffled by wind and water, and she hated herself for listening. She didn't hate the enemy. She hated the inevitability. Another burst of anti-aircraft fire ripped through the belly of the plane. Nora cried out. Evelyn turned, eyes wide. Nora slumped forward, blood blooming across her flight jacket. "Nora!" Evelyn's voice cracked. She reached over, shaking her. "Stay with me! Come on!" Nora managed a weak smile, voice barely audible. "You always wanted the sky to notice you." "I think it just did." Then her hand went still. Evelyn's world went quiet, the chaos fading into a single, hollow heartbeat. She wanted to scream, but the sky took the sound away. With one engine dead and another sputtering, Evelyn banked hard, pulling the Vigilant Star into a slow climb. Her chest felt heavy, her vision blurred by tears and smoke. She didn't look back. The Atlantic was swallowing everything. The battle, if it could be called that, had lasted 2 minutes. 2 minutes of fire. 2 minutes that would be remembered by no one but those who lived through it. Evelyn's voice came over the radio, soft, trembling. "Command, this is Vigilant Star. Mission accomplished. Multiple confirmed. Returning with damage and casualty." There was no reply, just static and the low hum of dying engines. Below, in the deep, U-91 continued its desperate descent. Ingrid leaned against the periscope, water dripping from her face. "We're alive," Mueller whispered. Ingrid didn't answer. Her eyes were distant, haunted. Somewhere above, a plane burned against the horizon. Somewhere below, her crew prayed in silence. And between them, the ocean kept its secrets. The horizon bled red as the North Atlantic swallowed the sun. The sky was a bruised canvas of smoke and fading light. And the sea, that endless, merciless sea, rolled beneath like molten lead. Inside the shattered cockpit of the Vigilant Star, Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Hart forced her trembling hands to keep the control column steady. Her uniform was soaked in blood, not her own, but Nora Mitchell's, whose lifeless body still leaned beside her seat, her auburn hair sticky with oil and salt. The smell of burnt insulation mixed with the stench of fear. One engine coughed, another whined. The remaining 2 strained as the aircraft limped southward. Evelyn's voice cracked in the static. "This is Vigilant Star. Position 57 north, 29 west. Engine failure. Crew down." The radio gave no answer. She adjusted the frequency, but all that came through was the hollow hiss of the dying ether. She sighed, the weight of silence pressing on her chest. "All right," she whispered to the void. "We're on our own." The altimeter needle trembled as if unsure whether to give up or hold on. Evelyn checked the fuel gauge. 800 gallons. Barely enough to make it back to Argentia if the wind didn't turn against her. Her fingers brushed the small locket hanging from her neck. A faded photograph inside showed her younger self, smiling in front of a training aircraft, her parents proud beside her. That was before the war, before the world became a place where skies could burn. She wiped a tear with the back of her glove. "You wanted to prove them wrong," she muttered to herself, "and now you're just proving how long a plane can stay alive after dying." She looked out across the desolate expanse below. Pieces of wreckage scattered across the gray waves, faint fires flickering like dying stars. Somewhere beneath that black water, men were drowning, and she hated that part of her still wished they could be saved. She reached for her logbook, its cover frayed, pages soaked with humidity. With a shaking pencil, she began to write, May 12th, 1943. Attack successful. 2 confirmed sunk. Heavy damage to own aircraft. Crew casualties 1. Will attempt return to base. If found, tell them we saw the enemy, but also ourselves. She paused, staring at the words until they blurred. Then she tore the page free, folded it, and tucked it into Nora's pocket. "You'll deliver it," she whispered, voice breaking. "You always love to finish what we started." Beneath the waves, Kapitänleutnant Ingrid Weiss clawed her way toward the surface, lungs screaming for air. Her once pristine uniform was torn, soaked in fuel and blood. When her head broke through the surface, the cold 44 degrees air sliced into her skin like knives. Around her, debris floated, twisted steel, burning oil, lifeless bodies. She gasped, pulling herself onto a section of hull plating that had once belonged to U-913's deck. Only 3 others had survived. Eric Miller, her first officer, surfaced moments later, coughing seawater, his scarred jaw clenched in agony. His blonde hair was matted with soot, and the right side of his face was burned from the explosion below. He saw Ingrid and nodded weakly, his usual defiance replaced by raw exhaustion. 2 younger sailors followed, Seaman Carl Fischer, a boy of 19 with frostbitten lips, and Petty Officer Anke Vogel, one of the few women in the Kriegsmarine's logistics corps assigned secretly to sea duty. She was small, with black hair plastered to her cheeks and eyes that darted everywhere but the sky, as if refusing to acknowledge its vast indifference. They clung to the wreckage as the wind tore across the waves. Ingrid looked around, her breath forming clouds. "Status?" she demanded hoarsely. Muller spat seawater. "No lifeboats. Radio gone. I think we're the only ones left." Ingrid closed her eyes. "So, 4 ghosts on the dying sea." They drifted for hours, the Atlantic rolling beneath them like a sleeping giant. Every now and then, oil slicks would catch fire anew, lighting their faces with orange reflections of hell. Carl began to shiver uncontrollably, whispering through chattering teeth. "Will they come for us, Captain?" Ingrid didn't answer. Her mind flashed back to Kiel, to the day she received her orders. The cold handshake from Dönitz, the unspoken promise that success meant honor, and failure meant oblivion. She thought of her husband, Marcus, who'd fallen at Stalingrad, his last letter unreadable from bloodstains. "No one comes for ghosts," she said quietly. Eric tilted his head toward the horizon. "Something's burning. Aircraft." Ingrid followed his gaze. A faint column of smoke traced across the dimming sky. For a moment, she thought she saw it. The silhouette of the vigilant star, limping southward like a wounded bird refusing to fall. "So she lives," Ingrid whispered, half in awe, half in envy. She wondered what kind of person that pilot was. The woman who had found them, destroyed them, and now struggled for her own life above. Did she feel pride? Guilt? Did she even know they were still alive? Hours passed, the sea calmed, its fury spent, leaving only the slow rhythm of waves against metal. Carl's head drooped. Exhaustion had won. Anke began humming softly, a lullaby barely audible over the wind. "Schlaf, mein Kind, schlaf ein." Her voice trembled, breaking halfway through. Ingrid turned toward her, startled. "Where did you learn that?" Anke's lips quivered. "My mother sang it to me before she was taken to the camps." The lullaby lingered for a few seconds before fading. Then the boy stopped shivering. Ingrid leaned over. Carl's eyes were open, staring at nothing. His lips were blue. "He's gone," Eric said softly. No one spoke. The sea, indifferent as ever, began to close around them. Ingrid's mind felt heavy, drifting, between reality and memory. She imagined the corridors of U-913, her crew alive, laughing during rare calm nights. She saw her husband's face, heard his voice. "You'll outlive us all, Ingrid," she laughed bitterly. "Not long now." Eric shifted beside her. "Captain, what now?" She looked at the stars, faint and blurred through the smoke. "Now, Miller, we wait to see which side of the ocean takes us first." Above, Evelyn banked her crippled Liberator toward home, one engine sputtering out completely. The controls felt heavier with each mile. Her reflection in the cracked windshield startled her. Pale, smeared with soot, eyes hollow. For the first time, she realized how young she still was. The clouds ahead glowed red from the fires below. She thought of the U-boats, of the lives extinguished, and of the few that might still be clinging to life. Maybe they'll live, she thought, and maybe that's enough. She whispered into the dead radio. "To the ones below, May you find your shore. The sun finally vanished, leaving only darkness and the rhythmic sound of engines dying one by one. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment and listened, the heartbeat of a machine refusing to quit, and the faint echo of Nora's laughter still trapped in her memory. The war was far from over, but for now, the sky and sea had made their truce. The evening sky over the North Atlantic was an iron gray, the last light fading beneath low clouds streaked with rain. The HMCS Halifax, a sleek Canadian corvette built for convoy escort duty, cut through the rough water at 16 knots. Her deck shuddered with every wave, and sea spray whipped against the bridge windows. Commander Julia Stone stood at the helm, one gloved hand gripping the brass rail as she peered through her binoculars into the mist. She was 37, tall and broad-shouldered from years at sea. Her skin was weathered by salt and wind, her auburn hair cropped short beneath her officer's cap. Her face bore the stern calm of a woman who had seen too many funerals at sea and refused to let them break her. Beneath that discipline, though, lay a deep exhaustion, the kind that came not from lack of sleep, but from the endless toll of watching men die in gray water. At her side was Lieutenant Mark Donnelly, her executive officer, a wiry man in his early 40s with a rough beard and a quiet voice that carried authority without effort. His left hand, missing 2 fingers from an accident years earlier, rested lightly on the chart table. "Signal from Argenia confirmed, ma'am," he said. "Distress coordinates verified. They reported survivors, possibly enemy personnel. Approximately 180 miles northeast of our last patrol point." Julia nodded, eyes narrowing. "Set course. Maximum speed. We'll find them before the Atlantic buries them." She turned briefly toward the helmsman, a young sailor barely 20. "Steady as she goes, Seaman Clark." The boy swallowed hard and nodded. The crew respected Stone. She was strict, never cruel, and carried the air of someone who bore responsibility like an old wound. 5 hours later, as dusk thickened, the Halifax reached the coordinates. What greeted them was devastation. Oil slicks spread across miles of water, shimmering like spilled ink. Charred wreckage drifted, lifeboat fragments, wooden crates, and the occasional floating body, pale and silent. The air smelled of diesel and death. Julia lowered her binoculars. "My God," she whispered. "Looks like the whole damn sea caught fire." Donnelly's voice was low. "Orders, ma'am?" She hesitated, then said, "Launch boats. Any sign of life, we pull them in. I don't care what uniform they're wearing." Within minutes, Halifax's crew began their grim work. Small boats combed the wreckage under the flickering light of search lamps. Voices shouted over the wind, English, German, prayers. One by one, bodies were hauled aboard, some alive, most not. Medic Corporal Emma Reeves, a slender woman with sharp eyes and dark curls pinned beneath a scarf, knelt beside each survivor, checking for breath, for pulse. Reeves had joined the Navy after losing her fiancé in the Battle of the Atlantic 2 years prior. Since then, she'd patched up enemy and ally alike with the same unflinching resolve. "This one's alive!" she shouted, gesturing to a figure clutching a plank. The woman's uniform, though torn and blackened, still bore the insignia of the Kriegsmarine. Ingrid Weiss was barely conscious when they dragged her aboard. Her blonde hair hung in heavy strands over her face, her lips blue from the cold. Her once proud features were gaunt, the sharp lines of command softened by exhaustion. When Emma pressed a stethoscope to her chest, the faintest heartbeat answered. "Get her below," Reeves ordered. "And someone fetch blankets, now!" As they carried Ingrid toward the infirmary, Julia watched from the deck, her jaw tightening. "That's a U-boat commander, isn't it?" she asked Donnelly. He nodded grimly. "Yes, ma'am, Kapitänleutnant, according to her insignia." Julia's gaze lingered on the unconscious woman. "Then she's a survivor of whatever hell happened here." By midnight, 27 Germans had been pulled from the water. 11 others were recovered dead and sewn into canvas shrouds weighted with iron bars. The Halifax's decks were quiet now, save for the murmur of the sickbay below. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Hart sat shivering under a wool blanket inside a patrol plane's infirmary. She had been found at dawn by a secondary Liberator patrol, her crippled aircraft barely afloat after ditching near the convoy lanes. Her face was pale, her hands still trembling from exhaustion and cold. The rescue crew had pulled her out with minutes to spare. Now she stared through the porthole as the transport aircraft touched down on the Halifax deck to deliver her home. When the hatch opened, the humid air of the ship hit her like a ghost of warmth. A sailor helped her down, saluting. "Commander Stone's waiting, ma'am." Evelyn nodded weakly. Commander Julia Stone met her at the corridor outside the sickbay. "Lieutenant Commander Hart," she said, extending a hand. "We heard your transmission fragments. You did good work up there." Evelyn managed a faint smile. "Good work. That left hundreds dead, Commander." Julia's eyes softened, though her tone remained steady. "You also stopped what could have killed thousands. Don't lose sight of that." Inside the infirmary, the smell of iodine and metal filled the air. Rows of stretchers lined the narrow space. Evelyn walked slowly between them, her boots echoing on the steel floor. German sailors lay wrapped in blankets, some moaning softly, others staring blankly at the ceiling. She felt her chest tighten. She had seen these men only hours ago through her bomb sight, and now, here they were, human again. Then she stopped. At the far end of the room, separated from the others by a curtain, sat Ingrid Weiss. Awake now, her hair brushed back, a cup of water trembling slightly in her hands. Her eyes, icy blue and alert, lifted toward Evelyn as if she had known she would come. For a long moment, neither spoke. Evelyn saw a reflection of herself in those eyes. The same exhaustion, the same quiet defiance of women who had fought too long in a world that didn't believe they should. Ingrid broke the silence first. Her English carried the clipped precision of the North. "You were the pilot." Evelyn nodded slowly. "And you were below." Ingrid's lips curved faintly. Not a smile, but an acknowledgement. "I heard your engines before I saw death." Evelyn exhaled. "I saw your men before I saw my own fear." There was no hatred in their voices, only the weight of understanding. Two soldiers on opposite sides of a line neither had drawn. Evelyn took a step closer. "How many did you lose?" Ingrid's gaze lowered to the cup in her hands. "All but 3. She hesitated, then looked back up. "And you?" Evelyn swallowed. "1." The silence stretched again, filled only by the distant hum of engines. Julia Stone entered quietly, holding a clipboard. "Commander Hart," she said softly, "you should rest. Medical's ready in quarters for you." Evelyn didn't move. "And her?" she asked, nodding to Ingrid. Julia's expression was unreadable. "She's our prisoner now, but we'll treat her as we treat any soul we pulled from that water, with dignity." She turned to Ingrid. "Captain Weiss, you'll be transferred to a POW camp once we dock at Halifax. Until then, you're under my protection." Ingrid met Julia's gaze. "Protection," she murmured. "That's an unfamiliar word, Commander." Julia gave a small, tired smile. "It's one I still believe in." She turned and left, leaving the two women in a fragile quiet. Evelyn finally spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "You should know. When I saw your boats, I thought it was the end of everything." Ingrid's eyes softened. "And now?" Evelyn looked toward the porthole, where dawn was just beginning to bleed across the horizon. "Now, I think, maybe it was the beginning of something else." For a moment, the hum of the ship seemed to fade. Two women, enemies, survivors, mirrors, sat across from each other as the Atlantic rolled beneath them, bearing both the dead and the living toward the uncertain shore. The morning fog clung low over Halifax harbor, pale and heavy like breath on glass. The HMCS Halifax glided into port under a wounded sun, her hull streaked with salt and oil, her crew standing in silence. Gulls wheeled overhead, crying faintly, and the cranes on the docks moved with the slow precision of giants. War had scarred even the harbor. Half-sunken freighters, oil slicks, and tired men moving with mechanical purpose. Commander Julia Stone stood on the bridge, her gloved hands resting on the cold railing. She exhaled a thin plume of breath, eyes locked on the pier, where nurses, officers, and Red Cross trucks waited. Beneath the hard lines of command, she felt the same ache as every man and woman aboard. Relief mixed with the quiet guilt of those who had lived through what others had not. In the infirmary below deck, Evelyn Hart sat by the porthole, still in her torn flight jacket. Her hair, once neatly pinned under her cap, now hung loosely around her shoulders. The bruises on her hands had turned yellow at the edges, and the thin scar along her left cheek, a souvenir from shrapnel, caught the morning light like a pale thread. She watched the coastline drift closer, the wooden docks blurring into color through the mist. Around her, the hum of the ship had softened, as if the Halifax itself were sighing in exhaustion. The door creaked open. Ingrid Weiss entered slowly, one arm still bound in bandages. She wore a plain naval coat lent by the Canadians. Her blonde hair, now clean and neatly tied, made her seem almost spectral in the dim light. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Ingrid reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small leather-bound book, its corners darkened by water and smoke. "This," she said quietly, "belonged to my husband." She held it out, her hands trembling slightly. He was lost in 1942, in the Barents Sea. He was a U-boat officer, too. His last entry, she hesitated, then continued, was written the night before his ship went down. Evelyn took the book carefully. The cover was worn smooth, the ink inside blurred by salt. On the final page, in elegant German script, she read, "Das Meer erinnert sich an alles." The sea remembers everything. For a moment she couldn't speak. Her throat tightened, the weight of the words pressing against her chest. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Ingrid's expression was unreadable, part pride, part grief. He believed the sea keeps every story, every scream, every mercy. Evelyn met her eyes. He was right. Outside, the sound of docking chains rattled. Sailors called orders, and the Halifax came to a slow halt beside the pier. Commander Stone's voice echoed through the ship's speaker. "All hands prepare for disembarkation. Medical teams first." Evelyn stood, still holding the journal. Ingrid looked out through the porthole toward the harbor. "So, this is Canada," she said softly. Evelyn nodded. "It's cold, but it's home." A faint smile touched Ingrid's lips. "After this war, perhaps there will be only cold for both of us." They walked together down the narrow passageway to the deck. The corridor smelled of metal and damp wool. Crew members passed them with curt nods, some curious, some wary. Most had never seen a German officer up close, much less one walking side by side with an Allied pilot. When they emerged onto the deck, the cold air hit them full in the face. Red Cross workers climbed aboard, carrying stretchers. A priest murmured last rites over a row of canvas-wrapped bodies. Evelyn felt the wind sting her eyes, but she told herself it was only the salt. Julia Stone met them near the gangway. "Lieutenant Commander Hart," she said, her voice low but steady. "Your report's been requested immediately at the Naval Intelligence Office. They want every detail of the engagement." She turned briefly to Ingrid. "Captain Weiss will be escorted to the POW processing station. She'll be treated fairly." Ingrid straightened, her posture still carrying the trace of command. "Thank you, Commander." A young naval policeman approached, Private Henry Weller, no more than 20, with a nervous jaw and sandy hair peeking from under his cap. He saluted stiffly, holding a clipboard. "Orders, ma'am. I'll take the prisoner to the transport." His eyes flicked toward Ingrid, uncertain, as though expecting her to lunge or curse. Instead, she merely nodded. Julia placed a hand on his shoulder. "Be respectful, Weller. She's done enough fighting for a lifetime." As Ingrid turned to leave, she paused beside Evelyn. "Keep the journal," she said quietly. "Maybe one day you'll understand why we did what we did." Evelyn's lips parted, but words failed her. She watched as Ingrid descended the gangway, her figure small against the gray expanse of the dock, surrounded by soldiers, but somehow still solitary. A ghost fading back into history. Hours later, Evelyn sat in the intelligence office, her uniform replaced by a clean one, her hair pinned neatly again. Across the desk sat Colonel Harris, a thick-set man in his 50s with a square jaw and a permanent scowl. He smelled faintly of tobacco, and his uniform was pressed to a knife's edge. "Your Operation Hart," he began, flipping through papers, "destroyed 2 confirmed submarines and crippled a 3rd. That's a decisive blow. You'll be recommended for commendation." Evelyn stared at him blankly. "Commendation," she repeated, as if testing the word. "For killing them?" Harris's eyes flicked up, sharp. "For ending a threat to Allied shipping." He leaned forward. "You did your duty, Lieutenant Commander. Don't let sentiment cloud that." Evelyn forced a thin smile. "Of course, sir." When she left the office, The air outside felt lighter, though her chest felt heavier than ever. She walked, alone along the pier, past the cargo cranes and the smell of tar and rope. In her pocket, she felt the weight of Ingrid's journal, damp but intact. She opened it again, reading that final line. The sea remembers everything. She thought of the 2 minutes of fire, of the screams over the radio, of Nora bleeding beside her, of Ingrid's pale face on the water. The war had been reduced to numbers, ships sunk, tonnage lost. But the sea knew better. The sea remembered faces, names, choices. She looked out toward the Atlantic. It was calm now, deceptively gentle, the horizon blurring into the first light of sunset. Far across that same ocean, in a gray bunker beneath the surface of Berlin, Admiral Karl Dönitz stood over a map of the Atlantic. His eyes, cold and tired, traced the red pins that marked the resting places of lost submarines. The defeat off the mid-Atlantic Gap had broken his wolf packs. Reports lay scattered across the table. Intercepted transmissions, lost contact logs, failed rescues. The room smelled of smoke and despair. Dönitz, once a man of fierce confidence, now moved like a ghost himself. He had spent years shaping the U-boat fleet into the weapon of Germany's vengeance, and now it lay shattered. "No more daylight hunts," he said quietly to his aide, Lieutenant Mueller, a young officer with a nervous tremor in his hand. "No more wolf packs. We return to the shadows." Mueller nodded, eyes downcast. Dönitz turned away, staring out the small window toward the darkening sky. "The sea remembers everything," he muttered, unaware that the same words had crossed the ocean in another tongue. As twilight deepened over Halifax, Evelyn stood at the edge of the dock, her uniform coat fluttering in the wind. The last of the sun burned low, casting the harbor in crimson light. Behind her, the Halifax's engines cooled, groaning softly like a weary beast. She closed the journal and slipped it inside her coat. Her reflection in the water looked older, harder, yet somehow more human. She thought of Ingrid's voice, quiet but unbroken, and of Julia's words, dignity, protection, belief. She thought of every pilot she had flown with, every name written and erased by war. For a long moment, she simply stood there, watching the tide pull gently against the hulls of the ships. Then softly she whispered to the horizon, "The sea remembers everything."